the bead stacks up on the backside, causing excessive penetration. On the front side, because the rod was jammed right down against the metal, the bead will crown and undercut along both sides. Grind this out to avoid trapping slag. The metal will be thin from grinding, so you need to run another bead called a hot pass to add a little more metal and burn out any slag left behind. With 60-10, try stepping in the hot pass, not gouging quite as deep on the backstroke. Use a faster travel speed so you don't burn through, and watch the sides to avoid undercutting. You can also hot pass with a 332/70/18. Hold the rod fairly perpendicular. Carry the heat on the sides, moving across the center relatively quick. Don't try to build up a lot of weld, and make sure the sides of the puddle flow out so the top of the weld stays flat. Once the bottom of the joint is fused with any of these procedures, you're ready to fill and cap, and you will get better results using 60-13 or 70-18. If the metal isn't too thick, you may be able to finish with one more pass. On heavier metal, when more filler is required, remove all the slag between passes with a chipping hammer and wire brush. This comes with experience, but plan the weld. When several filler passes are required, overlap the edges of the previous beads if possible. The last filler pass should be slightly below flush. Try to leave the top corners of the bevel. With a slight side-to-side movement, pay attention to the arc gap. Don't jam the rod into the sides of the bevel. Keep the rod fairly perpendicular and the puddle flowing out to avoid crowning the bead. You may need to speed up or slow down to control the amount of filler metal deposit, but try to leave the top corners of the bevel. To cap the weld, angle the rod and slow down to build up a crown weld bead. Use the edge of the bevel as a guide to keep the sides of the weld straight. The finished weld should be as thick as the metal, so if you've penetrated deep, the cap only needs to be slightly wider than the bevel and above flush with the surface of the metal. Filling up more weld than you need doesn't add any strength, just takes longer and puts more heat on the metal. If the top of the bevel is too wide to cap with one bead, run 2 or more passes side by side to cap the weld. With a slight side-to-side movement, using the bevel as a guide, keep the outside edge of the first bead straight. Use the inside edge of the bead as a guide for the second pass. Adjust the travel speed and rod movement so the puddle flows out almost to the center of the first bead. The final pass will generally be smaller. Try holding the rod more perpendicular to the metal, running straight. Use a faster travel speed for less weld deposit. On a horizontal, angle the rod up slightly with a medium arc length. Try running straight without any rod movement. The first bead will help hold up the second pass, so hold the rod more perpendicular and travel fast enough to keep the bead from sagging. For the final pass, try angling the rod down slightly. Travel faster for a smaller bead. On verticals, you can either use small beads side by side or run a weave bead. Small beads are easier. Use the edge of the bevel to keep the first pass straight. Run as many beads as it takes, but try to leave the other side of the bevel for a guide to keep the final pass straight. If you're not limited to a maximum bead width by a welding procedure, you can try a weave bead. Start on one side, letting the puddle flow out to cover the edge of the bevel. Cross the center relatively quick to the other side and hesitate until the puddle flows out and covers the edge. Move the rod up a little, then cross, hesitate, move up, and cross. The upward progress is going to be slow, heating the base metal up more, so turn the amperage down a little. Use the edge of the bevel as a guide to keep the sides of the weld straight. For a smooth weld and straight edges, maintain a uniform arc gap and keep the upward progression tight. Weaving makes it possible to build up a lot of metal, but takes some practice to consistently produce a uniform finished weld bead. Whether you're filling or capping, you need to experiment with the amperage, rod angle, and travel speed, learning to control the amount of weld deposit and figuring out just how much metal you can carry without having it sag or drip. With the butt joint, we were joining the edges of the metal. When one piece overlaps the other, it's referred to as a lap joint. The edge, and especially the top corner, is going to get hot and melt faster than the surface, where the heat is being dispersed in all directions. You want to fuse the bottom corner while building up a full fillet with a slightly crowned weld bead. Lap joints can be welded all the way with a fast freeze rod, but the filler rods will produce a smoother finished weld. In the flat position, the weld is called a horizontal fillet, and you have two rod angles to consider, one in relation to the metal and the other to the weld bead itself. In relation to the metal, the rod angle determines the position of the fillet in the joint. The angle in relation to the weld controls the shape of the bead. Holding the rod perpendicular heats the metal quickly, spreading the puddle for a flatter weld. As the rod is angled back, the weld starts to crown. There are a lot of variables. You have to watch the puddle. With 60-10 or 60-11, hold the rod nearly perpendicular to the weld. With the arc on the leading edge, move the puddle into the bottom corner. Push it up to the top edge and bring the rod around to the leading edge. You may need to speed up or slow down to provide the heat, but always bring the arc back to the leading edge to fuse the corner. Watch the puddle flowing out to the top edge and tying in on the bottom. The fast freeze rods provide excellent penetration, but tend to produce a flat or concave weld. Even on thinner metals, it may take a second pass to build up a full fillet. The filler rods build up a smoother weld. Maintain a constant arc gap for a uniform weld bead, adjusting the travel speed and rod angle so the puddle flows out all the way to the top edge. Because the filler metal remains fluid longer, try running straight without any rod movement, keeping the arc on the leading edge of the puddle. On thicker metal, you may not be able to make a full fillet in one pass. You might be able to get it in two passes. The first one smaller and flat, then slowing down to carry more metal and crown the bead on the second pass. It might take 3 or more passes, and on heavy welds, use 70-18 to prevent the bottom beads from cracking. Put the first one in fusing the bottom corner. Chip off all the slag and wire brush the weld. Determine how far out the weld needs to be, and holding the rod straighter up and down, angled slightly back towards the weld, run a bead keeping the outside edge straight. Angle the rod more into the joint and perpendicular to the weld. Then run a second pass filling to the top edge. Overhead fillets really are like flat welds, just more awkward. Angle the rod into the corner with slight adjustments for different thickness metals. Keep the rod nearly perpendicular to the weld. Watch the puddle flowing out to the edge of the lap piece. As long as you keep the filler metal and base metal from overheating, that weld will stay right up there. On vertical lap joints, the outside corner is going to heat up a lot quicker than the surface. For vertical down welds, angle the rod up slightly. Carry the heat on the back piece. Move into the corner, pushing the puddle to the edge, then back out. Adjust the travel speed to stay ahead of the puddle and make sure you're on the leading edge of the puddle to move into the corner. You aren't going to build up a lot of weld on a vertical down, so you'll probably need to run a second pass. Vertical up with 70-18 will not only provide a stronger weld, you can also build up more filler metal in one pass. Always keep in mind that 70-18 is very sensitive to the arc gap. You don't want to jam the rods into the sides or long arc across the center. Carry the heat on the back piece. As soon as the puddle flows out, move into the corner, letting the filler metal flow to the outside edge, even pulling the rod out a little if necessary to maintain a uniform